Hello, and welcome to another episode of GotAnswers, where we go through all of the tripe that is offered on the Christian apologetics site, gotquestions.org. And the question that we're going through today is a doozy. Why should I believe in Christ's resurrection? If you don't believe it's a doozy, you'll see, because their answer is longer than those we normally tackle, even in this series. And I am probably, just a quick disclaimer, I'm going to say that we're going to skip around some things. I'm not going to hit everything on this as hard as we could or should, because this is a huge topic. But I didn't want to skip this, because this is a perfect example of the apologist crap that is peddled daily, especially from Got Questions, but any Christian apologist. And when you start talking about the proof for Christ's resurrection, this is where it just gets premium right here. So let's get into this. Their answer starts, "It is a fairly well-established fact that Jesus Christ was publicly executed in Judea in the 1st century AD under Pontius Pilate by means of crucifixion at the behest of the Jewish Sanhedrin. The non-Christian historical accounts of Flavius Josephus, Cornelius Tacitus, Lucian of Samosata, Maimonides, and even the Jewish Sanhedrin corroborate the early Christian eyewitness accounts of these important historical aspects of the death of Jesus Christ." Quick side note here, this is not as well established as people like to say. Now, I'm not sitting here telling you that Jesus didn't live or that he wasn't crucified. Let's just say that they try to paint it as Christians and non-Christians alike usually try to paint this as being like, well, at least we know there was Jesus and that he was crucified. And I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying that they paint it like there's no questions. And it's a topic for another video, another day, that there's some problematic so-called evidence here, especially in the accounts of the people that they have brought up here with regard to Josephus and Tacitus. But again, we'll go into that another time. Don't want to bog down this with that. As for his resurrection, there are several lines of evidence which make for a compelling case. The late jurisprudential prodigy and international statesman, Sir Lionel Luckhoo of the Guinness Book of World Records fame for his unprecedented 245 consecutive defense murder trial acquittals, epitomized Christian enthusiasm and confidence in the strength of the case for the resurrection when he wrote, "I have spent more than 42 years as a defense trial lawyer, appearing in many parts of the world, and am still in active practice. I have been fortunate to secure a number of successes in jury trials, and I say unequivocally, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt." Wow. Really? They quote Sir Lionel Luckhoo of the Guinness Book of World Records, who's famous for his biblical scholarship. Oh, wait, no, he's not. He's famous for being some type of historian who knows all. Oh, wait, no, he's not. He's famous for being a great architect who has gone into these sites and found evidence. Oh, wait, no, he hasn't done that. No, he's a trial lawyer. And they try to bolster up his creds, like, wow, he had Guinness World Record for his unprecedented 245 consecutive defense murder trial acquittals. What does that have to do with the evidence or the proof of the resurrection of Jesus? Absolutely nothing. And even then, even if we just brush aside the fact that they brought in a so-called expert for his quote, and he is not an expert in any way that has any bearing on this debate at all. But on top of that, then the quote he gives, it offers no more compelling points whatsoever for why we should believe that Jesus was resurrected. It's just him saying, oh, unequivocally, it's no doubt. Sure, whatever, dude. I can come up with my own experts, who would just give worthless quotes, experts that have nothing to do with biblical literacy or literalism, and they would just give quotes that have no substantive meaning. And what does that prove? Absolutely nothing. The secular community's response to the same evidence has been predictably apathetic in accordance with their steadfast commitment to methodological naturalism. For those unfamiliar with the term, methodological naturalism is the human endeavor of explaining everything in terms of natural causes and natural causes only. If an alleged historical event defies natural explanation, e.g., a miraculous resurrection, secular scholars generally treat it with overwhelming skepticism, regardless of the evidence, no matter how favorable and compelling it may be. First of all, their straw man of methodological naturalism sounds a hell of a lot like Jordan Peterson, but I'm not saying that methodological naturalism is wrong or is inaccurate here. But it's funny how they try to present this like, oh, that's a bad thing. Like, how dare you treat extraordinary claims as though they require extraordinary evidence. But then this last sentence just exposes their intellectual bankruptcy, because it says, if an alleged historical event defies natural explanation, secular scholars generally treat it with overwhelming skepticism. Yeah. Regardless of the evidence. No, that's not true. No matter how favorable and compelling it may be, they obviously have no idea what the terms evidence or compelling actually mean. And you're going to see that really soon. So we'll move on. Like I said, it's kind of a longer one. In our view, such an unwavering allegiance to natural causes, how dare you want evidence for extraordinary claims like a resurrection, but such an unwavering allegiance to natural causes, regardless of substantive evidence to the contrary, is not conducive to an impartial and therefore adequate investigation of the evidence. We agree with Dr. Werner von Braun and numerous others who still believe that forcing a popular philosophical predisposition upon the evidence hinders objectivity, or in the words of Dr. von Braun, to be forced to believe only one conclusion would violate the very objectivity of science itself. How dare they to invoke Werner von Braun and to pull up this quote from him and to twist it in such a ridiculous way, as though they are the ones who want to think of all the possible conclusions. And GotQuestions.org, they're the ones who have carefully thought out everything that could have happened, and yet they carefully came to this conclusion. Because Lord knows no one from GotQuestions.org was ever going to come to this question with some predisposition. No. But you see how they take a famous scientist quote and just shamelessly wrench it to their own needs. Having said that, let us now examine several lines of evidence for Christian resurrection. The first line of evidence for Christ's resurrection. To begin with, we have demonstrably sincere eyewitness testimony. Early Christian apologists cited hundreds of eyewitnesses, some of whom documented their own alleged experiences. Many of these eyewitnesses willfully and resolutely endured prolonged torture and death rather than repudiate their testimony. This fact attests to their sincerity, ruling out deception on their part. According to the historical record, the book of Acts, Pliny's letters to Trajan, etc., most Christians could end their suffering simply by renouncing the faith. Instead, it seems that most opted to endure the suffering and proclaim Christ's resurrection unto death. Oh man, where do we start? There are not hundreds of eyewitness testimonies. There are places where apologists have claimed to have heard hundreds of eyewitness testimonies. That does not mean we have the eyewitness testimonies. And even in those cases where we have apologists saying that, oh, I talked to hundreds of people and they told me this thing, that's not even an eyewitness testimony. That's hearsay. You quoted your guy from the law courts earlier, okay? Eyewitness testimony is, of course, not even held for any value at all in a scientific sense, but in a court sense, fine. They use eyewitness testimony. But when you have to have an apologist who's saying, I heard all sorts of other people say this thing, that's not even allowed as evidence. It's called hearsay. That's what they're talking about here. And then they talk about, it says, according to the historical record. And then the first thing they quote is the book of Acts. Yes, when they want to talk about a historical record, they cite the Bible. Okay. And then they get into this, and they're going to get into this more in a second, but they get into this whole suffering fallacy. And this is a common apologetics trope, right? Well, people were tortured for this. People were martyred for this. Why would they do that if it's not true? These are people who have never heard of Heaven's Gate. These are people who have apparently never heard of Jonestown. These are people who have literally no idea whatsoever how social indicators and cults work. They have no idea about the extreme stuff that people will do when they are under the influence of these. So it is the fact that they would even cite the purported suffering of people that have been written down as supposedly having been tortured years later is ridiculous. Oh, by the way, also a lot of these hearsay accounts weren't even written down anywhere near the time of Jesus. They were written down in these the New Testament books, many of which were written long after the death of Jesus or any of the apostles. Like I said when I started this answer, there's a whole series of things that can't even be covered in a single video. This is one of the tactics that apologists use. They won't just throw out here this one little nugget of falseness because they know that's easier to refute. They will pull out the fire hose and just start spraying you so fast with bullshit that it's almost impossible to deal with it. Even here on a video when I have all day, I don't want to make a 6-hour video. You don't want to watch a 6-hour video. So there's only so much of this we can get into. But what they are quoting here in terms of these eyewitness testimonies is complete and utter bullshit. Now, they do allude to some of this. It says, granted, while martyrdom is remarkable, it is not necessarily compelling. True. It does not validate a belief so much as it authenticates a believer. No, it does neither. By demonstrating his or her sincerity in a tangible way. Yes, it demonstrates their sincerity. It can be sincerity for complete fiction. What makes the earliest Christian martyrs remarkable is that they knew whether or not what they were professing was true. How do you know that? And you'll see how they completely, they're about to tell you that when it's Christians doing it, they know that it's true and they're telling the truth. When they're not Christians, then they're liars. So you'll see. What makes the earliest Christian martyrs remarkable is that they knew whether or not what they were professing was true. They either saw Jesus Christ alive and well after his death, or they did not. This is extraordinary. There's nothing extraordinary about having seen something or not. If it was all just a lie, why would so many perpetuate it given their circumstances? Again, look up cults. Why would they all knowingly cling to such an unprofitable lie in the face of persecution, imprisonment, torture, and death? You understand nothing about cults. Now this is where it gets even worse. While the September 11th, 2001 suicide hijackers undoubtedly believed what they professed, as evidenced by their willingness to die for it, they could not and did not know if it was true. They put their faith in traditions passed down to them over many generations. In contrast, the early Christian martyrs were the first generation. No, they were not. Either they saw what they claimed to see or they did not. Among the most illustrious of the professed eyewitnesses were the apostles. They collectively underwent an undeniable change following the alleged post-resurrection appearances of Christ. Exactly, the alleged post-resurrection appearances of Christ. Immediately following his crucifixion, they hid in fear for their lives. Following the resurrection, they took to the streets, boldly proclaiming the resurrection despite intensifying persecution. What accounts for their sudden and dramatic change It certainly was not financial gain. The apostles gave up everything they had to preach the resurrection, including their lives. Yeah, they were fanatics. Being fanatical doesn't make what you're fanatical about true. Stop being an intellectual idiot. Just have some honesty here. My gosh. Second line of evidence for Christ's resurrection. A second line of evidence concerns the conversion of certain key skeptics. Because we got converts, that means it must be true. Most notably, Paul and James. Paul was of his own admission a violent persecutor of the early church. After what he described as an encounter with the resurrected Christ, Paul underwent an immediate and drastic change from a vicious persecutor of the church to one of its most prolific and selfless defenders. Like many early Christians, Paul suffered impoverishment, persecution, beatings, imprisonment, and execution for a steadfast commitment to Christ's resurrection. There's some real bullshit here. Let's be clear. Yes, did Paul and all of the others, did they suffer something? Yes. But also, until they were ultimately martyred, and not all of them were martyred, by the way, but until they were ultimately martyred, they also received community. They received being part of a certain in-crowd, being part of a certain secret society. Because Lord knows there's no one around who ever revels in being part of a secret society, right? Yeah. James was skeptical, though not as hostile as Paul. A purported post-resurrection encounter with Christ turned him into an inimitable believer, a leader of the church in Jerusalem. We still have what scholars generally accept to be one of his letters to the early church. Like Paul, James willingly suffered and died for his testimony, a fact which attests to the sincerity of his belief. Yeah, it attests that he believed this crap. That doesn't make any of it true. Your sincerity for fanaticism makes nothing true. The third and fourth lines of evidence for Christ's resurrection. A third line and fourth line of evidence concern enemy attestation to the empty tomb. Oh God, the empty tomb. And the fact that faith in the resurrection took root in Jerusalem. Jesus was publicly executed and buried in Jerusalem. It would have been impossible for faith in his resurrection to take root in Jerusalem while his body was still in the tomb, where the Sanhedrin could exhume it, put it on public display, and thereby expose the hoax. Instead, the Sanhedrin accused the disciples of stealing the body, apparently in an effort to explain its disappearance and therefore an empty tomb. How do we explain the fact of the empty tomb? Here are three most common explanations. First of all, notice how they pulled this sleight of hand. How do we explain the fact of the empty tomb? The fact which we know is a fact because it's written in our holy book. To be clear, I'm not even telling you that maybe there was an empty tomb, but the idea that they just glossed over that, and of course, it's a fact. Then how do we explain that fact? This is Christian apologetics 101. It's to throw out these complete bullshit non-facts and then throw them back at you. Well, then how do you explain that fact? You know, I had a demon fly out of my arse this morning. How do you explain that fact? What, you can't explain it? Well, then it must be true. First possible explanation that they give us. The disciples stole the body. If this were the case, they would have known the resurrection was a hoax. Yeah, they would not therefore have been so willing to suffer and die for it. That does not follow. That does not follow. All of the professed eyewitnesses would have known that they hadn't really seen Christ and were therefore lying. With so many conspirators, surely someone would have confessed, if not to end his own suffering, then at least to end the suffering of his friends and family. The first generation of Christians were absolutely brutalized, especially following the conflagration in Rome in AD 64, a fire which Nero allegedly ordered to make room for the expansion of his palace, but which he blamed on the Christians in Rome in an effort to exculpate himself. As the Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus recounted in his Annals of Imperial Rome, published just a generation after the fire, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero illuminated his garden parties with Christians whom he burnt alive. Surely someone would have confessed the truth under the threat of such terrible pain. The fact is, however, we have no record of any early Christian denouncing the faith to end his suffering. Instead, we have multiple accounts of post-resurrection appearances and hundreds of eyewitnesses willing to suffer and die for it. If the disciples didn't steal the body, how else do we explain the empty tomb? Yeah, how else? Some have suggested that Christ faked his death and later escaped from the tomb. This is patently absurd. According to the eyewitness testimony, Christ was beaten, tortured, lacerated, and stabbed. He suffered internal damage, massive blood loss, asphyxiation, and a spear through his side. There is no good reason to believe that Jesus Christ, or any other man for that matter, could survive such an ordeal, fake his death, sit in a tomb for 3 days and nights without medical attention, food, or water, remove the massive stone which sealed his tomb, escape undetected without leaving behind a trail of blood, convince hundreds of eyewitnesses that he was resurrected from the death and in good health, and then disappear without a trace. Such a notion is ridiculous. So it's kind of weird here. It says first the disciples, it talks about here are 3 most common explanations. The disciples stole his body. He faked his own death, and I don't know where the third one is. But anyway, they put up another straw man here. Okay, they're saying, oh, well, if the disciples stole his body, that doesn't make any sense because then they'd all know it's a hoax. No, even if the disciples stole his body, that doesn't mean that they all stole his body. All it takes is one disciple to steal his body. And even then, they're putting in this false dichotomy like, oh, if Jesus faked his own death or the disciples stole his body. No, anyone could have stolen his body. All it would have taken is one person with some silver to pay the right Roman guard to say, hey, make sure this body never makes it to the tomb. That's all it takes. We don't even have to know who that person is. And if you don't think that anybody had any incentive to do that, then you don't understand anything about the politics of Roman age Judea. So this makes their arguments make no damn sense at all. Again, I could go into this in more detail, but I'm trying to get through this as fast as possible without making this single response ridiculous, because there's about 10 BS pieces here to go through that they just gloss over so quickly. The 5th line of evidence for Christ's resurrection. Finally, the 5th line of evidence concerns a peculiarity of the eyewitness testimony. In all of the major resurrection narratives, women are credited as the first and primary eyewitnesses. This would be an odd invention, since in both the ancient Jewish and Roman cultures, women were severely disesteemed. Their testimony was regarded as insubstantial and dismissible. Given this fact, it is highly unlikely that any perpetrators of a hoax in first century Judea would elect women to be their primary witnesses. Of all the male disciples who claimed to see Jesus resurrected, if they all were lying and the resurrection was a scam, why did they pick the most ill-perceived, distrusted witnesses they could find? Dr. William Lane Craig explains, when you understand the role of women in first century Jewish society, what's really extraordinary is that this empty tomb story should feature women as the discoverers of the empty tomb in the first place. Women were on the very low rung of the social ladder in first century Israel. There are old rabbinical sayings that said, let the words of law be burned rather than delivered to women, and blessed is he whose children are male, but woe to him whose children are female. Women's testimony was regarded as so worthless that they weren't even allowed to serve as legal witnesses in the Jewish court of law. In light of this, it's absolutely remarkable that the chief witnesses to the empty tomb are these women. Any later legendary account would have certainly portrayed male disciples as discovering the tomb. Peter or John, for example. The fact that women are the first witnesses to the empty tomb is most plausibly explained by the reality that, like it or not, they were the discoverers of the empty tomb. This shows that the gospel writers faithfully recorded what happened, even if it was embarrassing. This bespeaks the historicity of this tradition rather than its legendary status. There's so much that is ridiculous about this. First of all, like I said, the idea that it had to be one of the disciples that took the body, or that's completely fallacious. It could have been anyone. It could have been that the body never even made it to the tomb. And if that was the case, who would have been the first people who would have gone to the tomb? It wouldn't have been the dudes. It would have been the women. The women were more likely to be the first ones who arrived at the tomb. This is more of what happened with women and funerals and burial rites after the fact than men. That doesn't mean that any of them knew that they were going to find an empty tomb. But just because they didn't know they were going to find an empty tomb doesn't mean that the fact that the empty tomb was empty was because Jesus was resurrected. That's what's so ridiculous about this. These lines, in summary, these lines of evidence, the demonstrable sincerity of the eyewitnesses, who gives a rat's ass? The conversion and demonstrable sincerity of key intent. Again, sincerity is never evidence for anything. The facts of the empty tomb, that's not a fact, you don't know it. Enemy attestation to the empty tomb. Again, who cares? The fact that all of this took place in Jerusalem, where faith in the resurrection began and thrived, that proves nothing. The testimony of the women, the significance of such testimony given the historical context, all of these strongly attest to the historicity of the resurrection. We encourage our readers to thoughtfully consider these evidences. But then why did you give us nothing but claptrap? What do they suggest to you? Having pondered them ourselves, we resolutely affirm Sir Lionel's declaration. There we go with Sir Lionel again. What does he have to do with this at all? The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt. Or put another way, trust me, I'm a Christian. Why would I ever lie to you? Yeah. Again, I've had to go through this pretty quickly because I didn't want this to be a 6-hour video. I am going to provide my own conclusion on this and just tell you this. There will be other videos about this in the future. But here is what Christian apologists never want to say. And it's so sad because it's so easy to say. And it really lets you off of the hook for all of this ridiculous bullshit. Okay? Here's all you have to say. The idea that there is a man named Jesus, well, first of all, the idea that he was the Son of God can neither be proven nor disproven. You cannot prove that. That is an article of faith. The idea that he was crucified, even if we accept, okay, Jesus was there, he was crucified, let's just give you that. The idea that he was resurrected is an article of faith. Any attempt to prove or disprove this is logically ridiculous because I can't disprove it. The only way you could disprove it is if I said, here's the body of Jesus. But of course, any opportunity to prove anything like that is long gone. Even if I had a bunch of bones and I thought that they were Jesus's bones, how would we ever prove that? I mean, we don't have his DNA. We don't know. So that's not going to happen. We're not going to disprove the resurrection, nor do I care to. But also have the intellectual honesty and integrity to realize that you cannot prove that someone rose from the dead. Why? Because you have hearsay accounts of an empty tomb. Come on, man. Give your readers more credit. I'd say give them more credit, but there's all kinds of apologists out there who lap this shit up. Hook, line, and sinker. But all of this ridiculous BS goes away when you're just honest with yourself. And you just say, you know what? The idea that this guy rose up into heaven, I mean, if you want to believe it because it's part of your faith, then believe it. then hold on to that. I'm not mad at you for that, but don't try to give me this ridiculous crap about how there's any proof for it at all and that somehow the proof is overwhelming because somebody in our holy book wrote down accounts of other people who supposedly saw this. I mean, come on, man. That wouldn't even stand up in a civil court. But you want to hold this stuff up as proof. You can't prove the resurrection. You can't disprove it. It's an article of faith, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And the sooner that you grow up and understand that, the sooner you'll be stronger in your own faith. Yeah, I said it. Anyway, thank you for joining us again on this juicy episode of Got Answers. Thank you for being with me through this video and maybe through others that you've watched. Hit like, hit subscribe, throw in all your nasty comments in down below. I can't wait to hear them. I am your boy, Adam of NOLA, and this channel is Skepticism, and you've been watching my series, Got Answers.